Always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the light side of...
Okay, last time we were looking at hassles and uplifts as a cause of stress, and today we're thinking about work. Now, it's pretty clear that work can cause stress. What we're going to be thinking about is why, how exactly, and what evidence is there for it. But before we start looking at that, I thought it would be interesting to think about what kinds of work you think might be the most stressful. Have a little think. I don't know if you've got any ideas. I've got the top 10 most stressful jobs 2012. Now, this data was mainly got from a Careers Quest website, and you may not agree. They have conducted a fair amount of research on it, but the US and the UK are quite interestingly different. US includes things like soldier, military general, police officer, event coordinator, public relations executive, corporate executive, photojournalist and taxi driver. UK looks quite different. It includes lots and lots of public sector jobs, which the US doesn't. Now, whether that's to do with the way those jobs are structured in the UK compared to the US, or whether it's to do with the culture we have over here, who knows. But it includes things like prison officer, police worker, social work, teaching, ambulance, nursing. So quite a different list than the US. Okay, I also thought you might just be interested to see the least stressful jobs, including things like jeweller, hairstylist, dressmaker. So if you fancy a stress-free life, those are the things to go for. That, again, was an American list, though, I hasten to add. Okay. Why is it so stressful? Okay, stress is the second biggest occupational health problem in the UK. That means it is going to cause a huge amount of sick leave. Okay, and in fact, according to a recent study by the American Psychological Association, more than 1/3 of all workers say they typically feel tense or stressed out during their work days. Okay, that is a huge, huge number. 20% report that the average daily stress level is an 8, 9 or 10 on a 10-point scale. Okay, and a huge number of studies show that job stress is far and away the major source of stress for American adults. Okay, and that it's escalated. That means it's increased progressively over the past few decades. So job is rated as the highest source of stress, and we know that stress has increased enormously due to jobs over the past few decades. So what kind of things is it that cause stress? Well, there's a huge long list there. It can be things like responsibility, meeting deadlines, long hours, repetitiveness, lack of control, and actually that's something we'll be looking at more in the next video. A huge number of different things. And in fact, in America, the link between stress and job is so well known that in New York, Los Angeles and other municipalities, so places in America, the relationship between job stress and heart attacks is so well acknowledged that any police officer who suffers a heart attack on or off the job is assumed to have a work-related injury and is compensated accordingly. So if you are a police officer in New York and you have a heart attack while fishing on holiday or whilst gambling in Las Vegas, you will get financially compensated because they will treat that as a work injury. They don't do that over here, I'm afraid. Okay, so we need to look at the evidence for this, okay, and the study that we used to support this is one that was done quite a long time ago, in 1978, so it's 35 years ago now, and that's Johansson, who did a study in a Swedish sawmill. Okay, so he was looking at whether work stressors, okay, so things that are causing you stress in your job, okay, and he looked at some specific things, and that was repetitiveness, machine regulated pace of work, so where the machine dictates how fast you have to work rather than you dictating how fast you work, high levels of responsibility, whether they all increase stress related physiological arousal, so that's physical symptoms of stress, and stress related illness. Okay, so who did he use? 24 workers at a Swedish sawmill. Okay, now you can instantly see there's going to be an evaluation point here. The sample size is rather small. Okay, and there were two groups, 14 workers, okay, who were in the high risk group. So they worked on the production line, okay, they were finishers. They worked at a set pace, and it was governed by the production line. It was complex. They had to have a specific significant knowledge of the raw materials, and they had a high level of responsibility because they determined their own and others' wages, because they were responsible for when the product was completed. And the more products they complete, the more money the company makes, and therefore the higher the wages everybody gets. The other group was the low risk group, okay, and they were generally cleaners or maintenance workers, and there were only 10 in the control group. Okay, what was their methodology? So it's a quasi-experiment. I hope you can all remember what that means. Okay, so there were some naturally occurring independent variables. They used 2 different methods to gather data on stress. So there were the physiological measures, and that was looking at certain chemicals we'll talk about in a minute in their urine, and they also used self-report method on their mood. It was an independent measures design, so we've already talked about the fact that it was a quasi-experiment. Participants already worked in one of the 2 categories. So the independent variable is whether they were a high risk worker or a low risk worker. Okay, what did they actually do? So each participant was asked to give a daily urine sample when they arrived to work, so first thing in the morning, and then at 4 other points during the day. So you've got 5 points when you're collecting urine samples altogether. At each of those points, they also gave some self-reports on mood, alertness, caffeine and nicotine consumption. Okay, and in order to get baseline data, so data that they can compare, they took the same data at the same times on days when they weren't working as well, so when they were at home, to see what their stress levels were like, and what those measurements were like on days when they weren't in work. Okay, in terms of what they were looking at in the urine, they were measuring adrenaline levels. Okay, so higher adrenaline equals higher stress. We talked about that when we looked at the introduction to stress. In terms of the self-report, they were given words such as sleepiness, well-being, irritation, and then they were asked to rate them on a scale, okay, from zero to maximum, which was the highest they had ever experienced, and they had to plot themselves on a kind of scale, on a continuum. They also looked at how much stress-related illness they'd suffered and levels of absenteeism, so how many days' work they had missed. Okay, what did they find out? So, even before they've actually started work, so when they first get to work, the high-risk group, so the finishers, already had adrenaline levels that were twice as high as their baseline measurements. So just the kind of thought and the prospect of going to work and kind of getting to work seems to be getting them stressed. And actually, from that point on, they continued to increase throughout the day. And even more importantly, the control group had a peak level 1.5 times higher than their base level measurement. So they are still increasing, but not as much as the high risk group. And actually theirs then declined during the rest of their shift. So whereas the finishers, their stress levels continued to go up, or at least their adrenaline levels did, the control group actually went down. Okay. In terms of the self-report methods, the high-risk group felt more rushed, more irritated, and they rated their well-being as lower than the control group. And the high-risk group also showed significantly higher levels of stress-related illness, things like headaches, and they had higher levels of absence from work than the low-risk group of cleaners. Okay, so based on all of that, what were the conclusions that Johansson drew? Okay, first of all, that particular combination of work stressors, so repetitiveness, machine pacing of work, and high levels of responsibility, led to chronic, and chronic means long-term, physiological arousal. Now remember we said adrenaline in itself and stress in itself is not a problem, it's that continued prolonged exposure to it that causes damage to the body, okay, and that led to stress-related illness and absenteeism. Okay, and their recommendations from that were that if employers wanted to reduce illness, which they should because it causes members of staff to be missing from work, which costs a lot of money for the companies, then they need to try and find ways of reducing those work stresses. Okay, and obviously it's going to vary from company to company what exactly that would mean, but by giving variety into their work and allowing them to experience a sense of control over their own pace of work. Okay, just in terms of the measurements and the methodology that they were using, it's important to notice that they did use qualitative and quantitative measurements. Okay, so have a think about which were the qualitative measurements and which were the quantitative measurements. and that allowed them to be able to compare the two groups quite effectively, but also to try and understand the impact of the higher stress level. So how did it make them actually feel? What effect did it have on their moods? Okay, obviously this is a study. You need to think about some of the evaluation points. So think about things like the sample, the size, the representativeness, the methodologies that they used. Okay, whenever you're thinking about stress, there's always the issue of subjectivity. Does somebody who rates a stress level as a 5 out of 10, okay, have exactly the same level of stress as somebody else who rates it as a 5 out of 10? Who knows? Okay, this is the problem. It's subjective. You need to think about the usefulness of the study. Were they able to control extraneous variables? This was a field experiment. It was done in the real life setting. Does that affect what other variables might be going on? Think
Always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the light side.